Thank you, Shannon, for all of our awesome attendees. We've almost got 200 people on the line already. That is outstanding. I am Nathaniel Stinnett. I am the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project, and we are so happy to have all of you here tonight. Thank you to Shannon Siegel, our organizing director. Ren Siniza, our organizing associate, is on the line as well. As Shannon mentioned, we respect your time. We do not want to go over. And so this is going to be a data-packed event, and we're going to throw a lot of, I hope, interesting information at you. But please bear with us. What we are not going to do is go over in a ton of detail who the Environmental Voter Project is, why we do what we do. This is not meant to be an intro to EVP. This is meant to be sort of a look ahead, what we're seeing on the horizon politically for environmental voter turnout. As Shannon mentioned, we will have a robust Q&A session, which hopefully will take up maybe 20, 25 minutes towards the end. But along the way, you are welcome to submit questions. Just please do so in that Q&A feature rather than the chat feature. All right, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen here. And Shannon or Ren, does that look good?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Okay. Welcome to Getting Out the Environmental Vote in 2022. We are so excited to have now well over 200 people with us. This is what the next 55 minutes is going to look like. Only very briefly are we going to rush through what the Environmental Voter Project does, why, and how we do it. What we are going to then spend most of our time on is the state of play in EVP's 17 states in 2022. This is what we see as really strong political opportunities for the environmental movement, and in particular for environmental voter turnout in the year ahead. And there'll be lots and lots of data because I know that you guys geek out about this stuff as much as we do. 3, we will then talk about the opportunities for you to get involved and do something with that data and mobilize these voters. And then we will have that Q&A session. Feel free to not hold your questions in reserve until the Q&A session, because when that session starts, what Shannon is going to do and Ren are going to do is Shannon's going to be throwing questions to me, and I'll be answering the questions that you submit in the Q&A box down there. So let's go ahead and get started. In a nutshell, the Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit that identifies environmentalists who don't vote, and then we turn them into consistent voters. A good way to think of us is we aren't in the mind-changing business. We are in the habit-changing business. We're not trying to get people to care more about climate or care more about the environment. Instead, we find the ones who already care but aren't voting. They need a behavioral intervention, and that's what we do. And we don't just try to get them to vote for one election. We try to turn them into habitual voters that turn out even in these smallest, lowest turnout elections you could imagine. Because the truth is, we don't just need federal leadership, we also need state and local leadership on climate and environmental matters. So how do we do this? 3 steps. 1, identification. We use data analytics and we work with data scientists to build predictive models on voter files of who these super environmentalists are. I realize I just said a mouthful. For those of you who aren't already deeply familiar with our work, you might be wondering what that means that I just said. In short, we are able, using lots and lots of polls, polling tens of thousands of people and combining it with a lot of data, to individually identify who these super environmentalists are on the voter file. And then we only talk to the ones who need our behavioral interventions. We only talk to the ones who aren't voting. But what we're able to do then is, because we're not targeting by demographic group, but rather by individuals, we can then deliver just to those individuals tested messaging, behavioral science informed messaging, by canvassing, by calling, by sending direct mail and digital ads, all optimized just towards one thing, and that is turning these non-voters into consistent voters. We run dozens, close to 100 randomized control trials each year, just fine-tuning this messaging, doubling down on what works, and forgetting about the messaging that isn't working. And then finally, habit reinforcement. We take this very, very seriously. We are not some secret one-off election-winning organization. Instead, our goal is to grow the political power of the environmental movement for every election. And so what we do is we find the states where there are huge, huge populations of these non-voting environmentalists. And then whenever there's an election, we use that as a behavioral intervention opportunity to improve their voting habits. And I really mean that when I say whenever there's an election. We've turned out voters for district attorney primaries in the middle of nowhere. We've turned out voters for library trustee elections. These are elections that by any objective measure have nothing to do with environmental policymaking. But if you care about voting behavior, if you care about creating good habits, well, every election is a precious opportunity that you can't let pass you by. So we take that third step, habit reinforcement, very, very seriously. These are the 17 states that we are working in, including just this month in February and March, we are mobilizing these low propensity environmental voters in Arizona, Florida, New Mexico, Texas. In the Q&A, if you have questions about why we're focused on these 17 states, I'm happy to go into detail, but very, very briefly, these are the states where there are disproportionately large populations of these non-voting environmentalists. In other words, this is where we know that we as an organization can have the greatest impact. Does that mean there aren't other important political states? No, of course not. There are lots of important political states that we are not active in. But this is where we are the best investment of your time and your donations. This is where EVP can have the biggest impact, are these 17 states. So I told you it would be really brief about who we are. If you're new to EVP and you want to learn more, please go to environmentalvoter.org/about. There is a lot more detail about who we are, what we do, and why we do it there. All right. What are some of our results? Very, very briefly. By the end of 2020, so we still don't have all the data yet from last year, from 2021, but by the end of 2020, in 12 of those 17 states, 730,000 of these non-voting and seldom voting environmentalists whom we had communicated with had started voting at such a consistent rate that we saw in public voter files. They had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and their most recent local election. They had gone from non-voters to consistent super voters who never skipped an election. This is the power of the behavioral science informed work that we are doing. This is why we don't just focus on the big sexy elections every 2 years, but instead understands that sweating the small stuff, getting involved in these teeny little primaries and local elections makes a difference, because that's how you change habits. Also in 2021, we had an enormous number of volunteers and donors support our work, and almost all of you on this call are part of that group. You helped us mobilize these low propensity environmental voters in almost 400 elections. We spoke to almost 4 million, or almost 3.8 million individual voters. We sent text messages, direct mail, had phone conversations, digital ads, knocked on doors. We don't have the results yet from our randomized control trials for the second half of the year. We're still waiting for those voter files to be updated. But just in the first 6 months of the year, you can see there in that third column, we were solely responsible while controlling for all other variables. That's what randomized controlled trials allow us to do. We were solely responsible for boosting turnout 0.9 percentage points among our targets in those 2 Georgia US Senate runoffs in early January last year. Almost $1 billion were spent in that election, in those 2 elections. For only $550,000, the Environmental Voter Project boosted turnout almost 1 percentage point among our 370,000 target voters. That's a big, big result. And as you can see, we were able to isolate our independent impact on turnout in many other elections, big and small, at the beginning of last year. And we really, really look forward to reporting back to you what our results are in the second half of the year. If you're interested in more information on our results, you can go to environmentalvoter.org/results. And I told you I'd be really quick about who we are, what we do, why we do it, and what our results are, and I meant it. Now we are ready to move on. So as we look ahead to 2022, what are we seeing? Well, our best guess is that as many as 13 million already registered super environmentalists are currently unlikely to vote. What that essentially means is they've never voted in a midterm election before, and maybe they voted in a presidential election, but nothing since then. Essentially, what we see in the voter file is our predictive models say, oh my gosh, these people care so deeply about climate and the environment that it's a top priority of theirs. Yet, they have never voted in an election, or they've never voted in an election that has lower turnout than a presidential. That is a huge pool of potential political power for the climate and environmental movements. That's what we're looking at across the country. Obviously, these midterms have a lot of important races going on. You can see these are the states where there are competitive US Senate elections, competitive gubernatorial elections, or both. Now, I want to throw a couple of caveats at you. First of all, can competitive be viewed in a lot of different ways? Of course, of course. There are some analyses here that I would probably disagree with. But by and large, the Cook Political Report, which is what we're using for our definition of competitive, does really, really good, detailed, and nuanced analyses of these races. And according to them, as of this morning, in these states, these are where the Senate and gubernatorial competitive elections are. Even if they are right, obviously these things can change, but this is the current state of play. Furthermore, there are going to be a lot of competitive House races. Now, one huge caveat to this is you'll see there are a lot of states that are still gray. In those states, they have not yet finished and approved their new districts. So those maps aren't in yet. And as you'll see, there are some big states that aren't in yet. New York, Pennsylvania, Florida, even places like New Hampshire are likely to have both of their districts be competitive. But those maps aren't finalized yet, so we don't have them up here. But as you can see, there are also some states, I mean, hell, California, I don't know if I necessarily buy this analysis that there will be 10 competitive House districts there, but there could be. And 7 or 8 sure sounds likely. But you can also see states like Arizona, Nevada, Michigan are going to have a huge, huge number of competitive House districts. Third map I want to show you is what you're looking at here is these are the 17 states that the Environmental Voter Project works in. Why do we work in these states? This is where we see huge populations of these non-voting or undervoting environmentalists. So I'm not saying that the states that aren't colored in are unimportant. Of course, Wisconsin's going to be important this year. It's going to be enormously important. Same as Ohio and Michigan and California. But these colored in states, this is where environmental voter turnout can have an oversized importance and impact. And as you'll see, when we combine all the things like the US Senate competitive races and the gubernatorial competitive races and the House competitive races that we know about, a lot of them we don't know about yet. Pennsylvania, Georgia, Florida, Arizona, Nevada, to a lesser extent, some of these other states, are going to pack enormous punches for your volunteer time and your donations. These are states where if we can pull environmentalists off the sidelines and get them to vote for the first time in a midterm election, it will have an enormous impact. Now, again, can these analyses change? Absolutely. When the new maps come out in Florida or Pennsylvania or New York or New Hampshire, might those states get darker? Absolutely. Might a lot of the political analyses of which races are going to be competitive change? Yeah, totally. Who knows how competitive all the races in Colorado will be or Alaska? A lot of these things can change, but this is where things currently stand. All right. Now we're going to very, very quickly, I promised all of you an enormous amount of data. We're going to very, very quickly go through a state-by-state analysis because I know you guys geek out about this stuff as much as we do. So let's get rolling so we can get to the Q&A session. Alaska. We have individually identified 11,941 super environmentalists who are registered to vote, but unlikely to show up for a midterm without a group like us mobilizing them. Now, I want to be clear, this is what the number is now. This number is likely to change. It's more likely to go down a little bit than up because we still don't have all the vote history data from the end of 2021. And obviously, if someone votes in an odd year fall election, that makes us think, okay, maybe they've become a better voter than we thought they were, which means maybe now they're likely to show up for a midterm. So these numbers are likely to go down a bit, although new registrations might balance that out. But this is where just these numbers currently stand. For context, 283,000 ballots were cast in Alaska last time there was a midterm election, and there was a less than 20,000 vote margin in that gubernatorial race. You'll see in Alaska this year, there's a Senate race up, Lisa Murkowski, there's a gubernatorial election, and there's a statewide House seat. Currently, none of those races are being deemed competitive. But again, I know that's a really loaded term that everybody can argue about. And even if you don't argue about it now, it can certainly change. But that's where things currently are. In the lower state legislative house in Alaska, things are very, very tight. So there, things are pretty competitive. Alaska has an August 16th primary, and their general is on November 8th, and you better believe we'll be mobilizing those 12,000 low propensity environmental voters there. Arizona. Oh man, does the environmental movement have a big, big opportunity to really, really move the dial in Arizona. We've identified over 250,000 already registered super environmentalists there who have never voted in a midterm. How does that stack up in Arizona? It's more than 10% of all ballots that were cast last time that they had a midterm election. And you can see how tight elections are in Arizona. We've got a competitive US Senate seat, Mark Kelly, an open gubernatorial, 4 new US House seats that are currently deemed competitive, and both of their state legislative houses are as tight as you can get. As tight as you can get. They have local elections coming up on March 8th, another slew of local elections on May 17th. They've got a primary on August 7th, and then obviously the general. We will be using all of these opportunities as ways to improve the voting habits of these 250,000 people we have in our sites. Colorado. Colorado is one of the states where there is the largest population of non-voting environmentalists. The latent political power, I should say, of the environmental movement there is truly enormous. Now, currently, other than 1 House seat and the state Senate, this isn't going to be a really, really hot and competitive state, but that doesn't mean that that 1 House seat isn't important, or that the state legislature isn't important, or that those Senate and gubernatorial races can't change. But this is the current state of play there. Colorado has a pretty early primary, June 28th, and it's a great opportunity to not just mobilize these important voters, but also test our messaging around mail ballots. Because Colorado, mails everybody a ballot, and Nevada, which you'll see is going to be another very important state, is going to be doing that for the first time as well. All right, Florida. We have identified 2/3 unlikely to vote environmentalists in Florida, so 666,000. How does that stack up? Well, 8.2 million people cast ballots in 2018. And I mean, it is very, very rare that a non-presidential election in Florida is decided by less than 40,000 votes. I mean, it's just where close elections happen. There is a competitive US Senate race. There is a competitive gubernatorial race. The maps have not yet been finalized in Florida, but there's every reason to believe that there will be quite a few really, really competitive House races there as well. Also, there are a lot of elections in Florida. We're mobilizing voters right now for elections there. And they've got local elections coming up later this month. They've got local elections in February, and then in March, and then their primary in August. And all of these are golden opportunities to call, to canvass, to postcard, for us to send direct mail and digital ads to all these voters. Moreover, Florida has a thing where you can sign up to get your ballots mailed to you, which is an evergreen opportunity for us to call these low propensity environmental voters, even when they don't have an election coming up, and improve their likelihood of voting. Georgia. I don't think I need to tell anybody on this call how important Georgia has become. When the Environmental Voter Project made our first expansion into Georgia, so we launched in Massachusetts in a proof of concept almost 6 years ago. And when we announced in the spring of 2017 that we were going to Georgia, everybody told me I was crazy. And we said, no, we think that there are a lot of latent environmental and progressive voters there. And we were right. And we were right. And it remains that way. There are almost 170 million, even after the record turnouts that we've seen in Georgia in election after election after election, there are still a lot of environmental voters on the sidelines. There's going to be a competitive US Senate race. There's going to be a competitive gubernatorial election. There's going to be at least one competitive House race. And as you'll see, Georgia has an early primary. As everybody is now painfully aware, almost every election in Georgia goes to a runoff. So then we get another bite at the apple communicating with these voters. And again, these are going to be great opportunities for our volunteers to knock on doors, call, and write to these voters. Iowa. Iowa was one of our new expansion states last year. And here's why. There are tons of non-voting environmentalists there, and the margins are smaller than you think. There will be a gubernatorial and a US Senate race in Iowa this year. Currently, neither of them are deemed competitive, but those things can change. 2 of Iowa's 4 House districts are going to be very, very competitive. This is a big opportunity for the environmental movement. I know some people kind of scratch their heads and they say, Iowa, really? Yes, Iowa, really, really. Same thing with Kansas, to a lesser extent, but still with Kansas. There is still an enormous number of non-voting environmentalists there. They have a US Senate race. They have a gubernatorial race that will be competitive. Laura Kelly won by a thin margin against a not very strong Republican opponent 4 years ago. She is up for re-election. Their congressional maps have not been finalized, but we expect at least one of them to be competitive. Maine. Tons of non-voting environmentalists, tons. That 106,000 number might not look like a lot to you, but only 634,000 ballots were cast in Maine in 2018. That is an enormous number for Maine, enormous. They're going to have a competitive gubernatorial election. One of their 2 congressional seats is competitive. Their state Senate is fairly competitive. They have a pretty early primary, and this is a really, really important opportunity for us to reach out to these voters. We want to be knocking on their doors. We want to be calling them. We want to be mailing to them. Massachusetts. You might think, what is Massachusetts doing in here? Well, first of all, local and state policy making matter just as much as federal policy making. Second, the very popular Republican governor in Massachusetts, Charlie Baker, has announced that he is not running, so it's an open seat. This is currently being deemed a competitive race by the Cook Political Report. Will it stay that way? I don't know. But boy, do we have a lot of low propensity environmental voters in Massachusetts. And if they turn out, boy, can the policy differences really be enormous at a state and local level. They have a very late primary in Massachusetts. Nevada. For my money, Nevada has the biggest return on investment for volunteers and donors this year. It's a very, very small state population-wise. Yet, they have a competitive US Senate race, a competitive gubernatorial. 3 out of their 4 House seats are competitive. Their state Senate is super, super tight. And last time there was a midterm there, fewer than 1 million people voted, yet we have individually identified over 115,000 already registered super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote. This is a really small denominator with an enormous potential numerator, an enormous number of environmental voters who, if we can pull them off the sidelines, could change so much, so much. And I forget who once said it. I wish I could properly attribute them, but like Nevada is like the Saudi Arabia of solar energy, or it could be. I mean, even if you put aside the political ramifications and just think of the clean energy opportunities and the other climate policy opportunities, Nevada is so important. And so please, 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 nobody sleep on Nevada this year, especially because they have an early primary. This is a great, great opportunity to talk to these people early and change their voting habits. This is such an early primary that every new person we get to vote, they're going to show up as having voted in the primary on the voter file in Nevada by September. So everybody who's running for office in November in Nevada is going to see these people. These non-voters we turn into voters. It's going to be like there's a bright red beacon next to their name in the voter file, and everybody's going to jump on them and say, hey, let's get these new environmentalists to vote for us. This is such an enormous opportunity. New Hampshire, another small state with a huge population of non-voting environmentalists. Remember that last denominator in Nevada? 972,000 ballots were cast in 2018 in Nevada, yet EVP has identified 115,000 targets. Well, our target number is pretty much the same in New Hampshire, but look, only 573,000 ballots were cast 4 years ago in New Hampshire. Again, this is a huge opportunity for environmentalists to punch above our weight this year. Competitive US Senate race, competitive, likely 2 competitive House seats. Even though their map has not been finalized, it's pretty hard to draw maps in New Hampshire without making both of those seats competitive. The state Senate is competitive. Currently, the gubernatorial race is not deemed competitive, but that can change. New Mexico. This was a very aggressive gerrymander by Democrats. There are 2 seats that are currently deemed competitive, and the gubernatorial that's deemed competitive. This is going to be more important than people usually think of New Mexico as being. This, again, is an opportunity for the environmental movement to really punch above its weight, and they also have an early June primary. New York. Huge numbers of non-voting and seldom voting environmentalists. Although the Senate and gubernatorial races are not currently deemed competitive, you never know, that could change. We don't yet have a congressional map in New York, but when it comes out, most people who really know this stuff really well expect there to be a whole bunch of races that are really competitive and important. A whole bunch of them. Moreover, of particular importance to the environmental movement, there's a ballot question next November, a $3 billion bond measure for climate resilience, clean energy policies, and other environmental matters. A really important bond measure. They've got a June primary and obviously the November 8th general We're getting to the end here, folks. I promised you data, and now you're regretting it, I think. All right, 277,000 targets in North Carolina, competitive, open US Senate race. Currently, one of the House seats is deemed competitive. Their state Senate is very competitive. They have a May 17th primary, and that could go to a runoff. It's not clear yet because there are just so many lawsuits up in the air in North Carolina. It'll likely be either a July 5th or July 26th runoff from that primary. That's a really, really early primary. And it's going to be a primary that a lot of people vote in because North Carolina had to postpone most of their municipal elections from the fall of 2021 to this spring. So coinciding with all these primaries, you're also going to have stuff like the Charlotte mayoral election and the Greensboro mayoral election and the Cary municipal election. And so this is going to be a really golden opportunity for us to build up these voters' habits and turn them out. Pennsylvania. If I had to pick a state after Nevada that would be hugely, hugely, hugely important, maybe it would be Arizona, but probably it would be Pennsylvania. Open US Senate seat, open gubernatorial seat. They haven't finalized their House map yet, but there are probably going to be a bunch of competitive House seats. The state Senate is really close. They have an early May primary. And oh boy, are there lots of environmentalists in Pennsylvania who don't vote in midterms. This is a big, big, big opportunity for the environmental movement and climate movement this year. Only two more states, Texas. The gubernatorial race is currently deemed competitive. They have only 2 House seats only. That's obviously a lot, but it's small for Texas. They have 2 House seats that are currently deemed competitive, and their state Senate is close. We've identified 634,000 targets in Texas. They also have a very, very early primary. Their primary is March 1st. Now, we're going to be running an experiment for that March 1st primary, and so we're not going to be doing lots of volunteer voter turnout for it. And there's still a small likelihood that due to the DOJ, the Department of Justice suit that was filed, that might get postponed. But there's also a statewide ballot question in Texas on May 7th. And also the March 1st primary might go to runoffs on May 24th. So we're going to get all these bites at the apple in Texas throughout the year, and we really, really want your help taking advantage of those. Finally, Virginia. 2 House seats are currently deemed competitive in Virginia. We have 545,000 targets there. They have a June 21st primary. And another great thing about Virginia, similar to Pennsylvania, similar to Alaska, similar to a lesser extent, Florida and Arizona, because they're changing their laws. In Virginia, there's an evergreen opportunity to contact these voters and help them sign up to get their ballots mailed to them. That's really, really valuable when you're in the voter turnout business, because that means you can improve someone's likelihood of voting, even when there's not an election to talk to them about. And so we're really excited to do that in Virginia, as well as in Pennsylvania, Alaska, to a lesser extent in Arizona and Florida, because their laws are in flux. All right. Sorry, I think I can see through my screen everybody like, squinting their eyes at these numbers. But what I wanted to do was throw all this data that I just recited to you in one document so you could see it together. And as you'll see, all of these states present enormous opportunities. I don't want to play favorites here. And obviously, time is an important variable. It's a lot easier to mobilize one of these voter targets when we're coming up to an election. So even if you look at this and you say, oh my gosh, Nevada is so important or Pennsylvania is so important, well, there are moments in time where it's easier to turn those non-voters into voters than others. And so throughout the coming year, all of these states are going to have very, very important opportunities for us. And by us, I mean the broader environmental movement. But certainly you'll see there are some states where, man, if we can succeed at the rates we have in the previous years and turn even just 1%, 2%, 3% of these non-voting environmentalists into voters, it's going to have an enormous impact, an enormous enormous impact. So that is where things currently stand. We would love for you to join us in turning these non-voters into voters. By design, I didn't get into an enormous amount of detail about the data science we use to find these voters, about the behavioral science informed messaging that we optimize to get these people to vote. But the results speak for themselves. Please go to environmentalvoter.org/results. We know how to find these people. We know how to turn them into better voters. And all we need is more volunteers and more donations. It's as simple as that. So you can help us by contacting these voters by signing up for phone banks. If you go to environmentalvoter.org/get-involved, you can sign up for phone banks. If you get trained, you can stop by any of our scheduled phone banks, or you can call on your own schedule almost every day. Almost every day we have lists up and scripts for you to call people. We have also started doing postcards. If you train online, we will then send you the postcards. We'll send you the script. If you want postcard stamps, we will send you those. Those aren't evergreen opportunities. They are periodic opportunities, but we have current opportunities. You can sign up for a training now, and we've got ones going into Tempe and Sarasota, and there will be other opportunities coming up throughout the year. And then door-to-door canvassing. Any day of the week, any week of the year, we will help you knock on doors where you live of non-voting environmentalists, so long as they're in the 17 states we work in. If you don't live in one of those states, you can travel to one of them. Contributions. Recurring monthly donations are so important to us. As I hope you now realize, talking to these voters with behavioral science informed messaging, every opportunity we've got is our secret weapon. That's our secret weapon. Yeah, we like to think we're smart. Yeah, we like to think we're efficient and we run a tight ship. But the truth of the matter is our stubbornness is what gets us these results. Our adherence to this, our obsession with using every single election as a way to change voting behavior. That is what gets us these great results. But I got to tell you, as the executive director of a nonprofit, it's hard to build a budget around hundreds of different elections without being able to see what's going to come in, without being able to predict what donations are coming in. So these monthly donations are enormously important. We also obviously care deeply about one-off donations, and early donations are so important. We're going to be able to convert non-voters into voters for something like 20 or 30 bucks a pop this winter and spring. But if the first time we talk to someone isn't until September or October, that conversion cost might be as high as 60 or 70 bucks a pop. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to go silent this fall, of course not. But what it also means is that there's a really high return on your investment early on this year. Finally, I'll just say before getting to the Q&A, if you want to introduce us to your friends, I would love to talk to you. Please email me or email any of us. You can reply to any of the emails that we send you. We're going to have a follow-up email to this that goes out tomorrow morning with a recording. You can reply to us, or you can email me at nathaniel@environmentalvoter.org. We would love to set up a 1-hour Zoom fundraiser with you. We'll give you everything you need to reach out to your friends. We only ask that you get 15 to 25 people there. I'll make a pitch. We'll have a Q&A session, and there's no donation required to show up. We'll just pitch them hard for money at the end, but it's a pretty easy ask. All right, we're going to get to the Q&A, but before we jump to that, I just want to finish with one thing. I know all of you care deeply about the state of our democracy and about growing the political power of the environmental movement. Please, please, please get in the game with us this year. We know this stuff works. We have literally individually identified by name and street addresses, creepy as that sounds. We know them by name and street address who all these non-voting environmentalists are. and we know what messages work to get them to vote. We just need you on board. And I'll be honest with you, we need you on board early. That's how we get the best results. All right, we have time for hopefully a nice, robust Q&A session. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I know that Shannon and Ren have been doing yeoman's work answering all of your questions, but Shannon, are there any ones that you want to send my way?
Absolutely. I think the first one that lots and lots of folks are asking, Nathaniel, is about texting. So clearly you did not mention texting as one of our planned options. So could you just provide a little bit more info on that?
Yes. So thank you for the people who asked about that. First, let me start with some background. So in October, all of the mobile phone carriers enacted what are called 10 DLC restrictions, which prohibit sending text messages to voters unless those voters have opted in to receiving those text messages from those particular senders, which obviously eliminates the ability to do any impactful voter turnout campaigns through text messaging. Now, they've said they'll enforce these rules with audits, with fines, and that they will dramatically restrict the number of texts that actually get delivered after they're sent. So even if you send the text, a lot of them might not be getting delivered. Now, I know we've communicated this a few times to our volunteers, so forgive me if I'm repeating this for a few of you, but I also know, shockingly, that you don't always read 100% of our emails. So just bear with me as I go into a little bit more detail, because I do know that there has been some confusion about, despite these new prohibitions being in place, some groups are still texting. They are, while EVP isn't. So let me explain a little bit about what's going on here, because this is a really, really good question, and I'm glad you asked. Hustle, the texting app that we've used for many years, has now literally made it impossible for us to continue texting without lying and opening ourselves up to enormous liability. What they now require us to do before we can send a single text to a voter is to promise to check a box promising that all of the people we're texting have individually opted in to receiving those texts. And as you know, we're not able to do that. And we don't feel comfortable lying. And so obviously setting our nonprofit up for additional liability by doing so, it's clearly not fair to our donors to have their money go towards paying these fines. Now, some organizations have continued to use Hustle and other apps because they have said that they doubt the fines will ever be enforced. And they might be right. We don't know that, but they might be right. Or they're not worried that some of their texts might not be being delivered. But we're not willing to take that risk at the moment. We think it's important to be able to look our volunteers and our donors in the eyes and assure them that their volunteer time is going towards texts that are actually being delivered and that their donations are having an impact. Finally, I just want to say, many of the other organizations have abandoned these commercial apps, but have gone in-house to get around these vendor liability issues. And we've discussed doing that as well. But that still leaves these organizations vulnerable to the potential fines and to undelivered text messages. And at the end of the day, we don't operate with a huge endowment or financial cushion, and we don't feel that taking on that level of risk and liability is a responsible use of our donors' contributions or our volunteers' time. Especially, I should add, when we're getting such amazing results from calls and canvassing and postcarding and direct mail and digital ads, and we have the receipts to prove it. We have the randomized control trials to prove it. So in short, I can assure you this is something we're tracking every week. Believe me, we'd love to start texting again. But our number one priority is being able to tell you we're not going to have to use our donors' money to pay fines, and we can promise you your texts are actually being delivered. If we can do that, we're going to start it up immediately again.
Well, perfect segue, Nathaniel. One of the other questions that did come up a few times is if you could talk about the relative efficacy of some of these different voter contact methods, and maybe why we are doing the ones that we're doing.
Really, really great question. Let me answer the second part of the question first. We are doing all of the ones that we are doing because there is a really significant additive and cumulative impact. One voter contact method almost never replaces the efficacy of another voter contact method. And the more you layer on different methods, the better your likelihood of actually reaching people, because some people you can't reach by canvassing because they live in a high rise, or some people you can't reach on the phone because you don't have their phone number. Some people you can't reach with digital ads because you can't match them online. But even those people you can reach with all of those, there's an additive effect. Okay, the first part of the question. We like to think of two metrics. So not just efficacy or effectiveness, but also efficiency. So what do we mean by those two metrics? Effectiveness is what is the boost in turnout that you could possibly get per contact made. So what's the impact per contact made? Efficiency is what is the impact per dollar spent or per volunteer hour spent. And as you can imagine, they're both important, right? Like canvassing, as I'm sure will come as no surprise to all of you, is the most effective, as in we get the highest increase in turnout in our randomized control trials from canvassing per contact made. But if you're a volunteer and knocking on doors for 2 hours, maybe you can knock on 60 doors. Maybe if it's a perfect time of day, 15 or 20 of like those doors actually open up to real live people. And so the number of contacts you can make over 2 hours is a lot less efficient for canvassing. So the most effective is canvassing. Right after that, the most effective is usually direct mail and digital ads, then phone calls. And right around with phone calls was texting. But I want to be clear, for all of these, we see significant boosts in turnout. All of them. Now, what's the most efficient? Well, when you're talking about volunteer time spent per vote gained, calling is enormously efficient. It's also efficient on dollars spent per vote gained, more efficient than even texting. As far as volunteer time spent, texting is more efficient than calling, but they're both really, really efficient. Also, digital ads give a really good ROI, but oddly enough, direct mail gives the best ROI. So per dollar spent, the number of additional votes that we get, direct mail is the best we can find. Old-fashioned direct mail. But these are things that we track really, really closely. And even though it might seem like I just gave some nuanced answers, the truth is I'm barely breaking the surface because we slice and dice all of this stuff. And we have enough data to tell, oh, we want to send mail to African-American teenagers here, but we want to do digital ads to Latina grandmothers here. And I don't want to say we know all of this stuff, but we certainly try to get as smart as possible, as often as possible, so we can optimize our messaging and our communication channels accordingly. But that was a really, really good question.
Absolutely. So another question, well, actually, I'll just very quickly answer something that's been in the chat a couple of times. And you all have heard that Nathaniel didn't mention postcarding in that because EVP is running our very first pilot right now. So in terms of looking at those direct comparisons, we will have that data to you shortly. I don't want people to think you forgot, Nathaniel. But another question that came up a lot, I know you talked in the slides about the states that we're in and where environmentalists can make a big impact, but there's been a number of questions about why aren't we in Wisconsin specifically, but also, why are we in some versus others? Could you reiterate that?
Yeah, really, really great question. Oh boy, is Wisconsin important. You will never hear me say otherwise unless at some point it becomes not important. But at the moment, boy, is it important. I cannot deny that. It's important on the federal level, it's important on the state level, it's important on the local level, and therefore it's important to environmental policy making. But there aren't that many non-voting environmentalists there. And so the truth is, no matter how good we are at what we do, the electoral and political and policy-making impact that the Environmental Voter Project can have in a state like Wisconsin is not only objectively small, but it is comparatively so much smaller than these 17 states that we are in. And as I've said a few times tonight, but boy, does it bear repeating, we know we rely on all of you. We rely on your donations, and we rely on your volunteer time and efforts. And boy, do we value that. We value it so much that we always want to be able to tell you, this is where we think your donation and your volunteer time can have the greatest impact. And the truth is, if we went to one of these sexy states, and they're sexy for a reason, believe me, Wisconsin is important, we wouldn't be able to do that with a straight face. Now, the good news is there are a lot of really politically important states where not only is EVP active, but we can have an enormous impact. Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, New Hampshire, so many of these states. I know I'm forgetting Florida, North Carolina, Texas, but if you see states that you know are really important and we're not there, states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Minnesota, it's because in our research, we haven't found enough non-voting environmentalists to justify telling you, hey, you should give us your time and money because we think we can make a huge difference here. Your time and money for Wisconsin, to be totally honest, is better spent with another organization. And we don't mind telling you that. We want to have that type of honest communication with you.
Absolutely. So I think that we have time for probably one more question, Nathaniel. And I would say, there's actually so many questions coming in right at the last minute. One question is, so clearly you talked about huge numbers of low propensity environmental voters and what a difference those could make in a lot of these states. Folks are wondering, how many of these voters do you think that we could turn out reasonably in a particular state? How far do we think that we could go for these midterm elections?
Great question. So obviously it varies from state to state. What I can tell you is in the Environmental Voter Project's infancy, way back when, last time there were midterm elections in 2018, we were in 6 states then. Across those 6 states, averaging our randomized control trial results, we increased turnout among our voter targets 2.7 percentage points over our control group. Now, 2.7 might not sound like a lot to you, but it is everything in this business. Everything. And to be clear, when I talk about randomized control trials, what that means is before we talk to a single one of these people, we remove 15% of them, set them aside in a control group, only talk to the remaining 85%. And then after the election, we compare turnout in those 2 groups so that we can prove how much we were solely responsible for that increase in turnout. So we know that we can be responsible for that. Now, obviously, we're not talking to every single voter. We're talking to these unlikely to vote environmentalists. But let's take some of these states. Let's take Pennsylvania. We're going to be targeting, at least based on our current analysis, 718,701 low propensity environmental voters in Pennsylvania. If, and I'm not saying we can guarantee this, not even coming close, but if we boost turnout there, even just 2%, well, that's almost 15,000 brand new super environmental voters that we brought to the electorate? Ourselves. Ourselves. Ask Joe Biden and Donald Trump how big a deal 15,000 votes are in Pennsylvania. These can be really, really big numbers. Additionally, I'll say, remember, we're not just making one-off interventions. We are talking to these voters during primaries, during local elections, and the cumulative impact of talking to them throughout the year can, by the time we get to November 8th, blow the doors off. So yeah, we can have a really, really big impact. But perhaps most importantly, even beyond those two things that I just said, what you also know is that we're going to follow up with these people. And on November 9th, we're going to get right back to work figuring out how to get the ones we missed and turn them into better voters. And so there will always be this tail, this return on investment that increases for years and years and years off of your volunteer time and your donation time. All right, we promised you that we wouldn't keep you late. I've got 1 more minute to make a close here. The first thing I'll say is I know that we've got a lot of questions in the Q&A. Shannon and Ren, thank you both for doing outstanding jobs answering what I imagine was most of the questions, but I also imagine we weren't able to get to all of them. Tomorrow morning, we will be following up with a recording of this webinar to everybody. If you still have questions for us, please reply to that email and ask them. We might not get back to you in a day, but we'll certainly get back to you within a few days. We would love to answer all of your questions. Also, I know that in the chat, there are lots of links about how to volunteer. We would love you to sign up to volunteer, about how to donate and become a monthly donor. I am not at all ashamed to ask for your donation. We know what we are doing works. We know that you are here because you care about adding to the political power of the environmental movement, and we need your help. And then finally, I'll just say this. Boy, do I know you're tired. I know we've been doing this for a while, guys. It's like we've spent 6 years like standing on the edge of like a political abyss with a climate crisis and a pandemic. Like, I know we're all tired. I get it. But I also know you wouldn't be here unless you recognized how high the stakes are and how important it is to have record-breaking turnout from these people who we are targeting throughout 2022. These stakes are so incredibly high. And I know when I hear those words come out of my mouth that I've said it so much over the past 6 years, but that doesn't mean that it's not true again in 2022, unfortunately. It still is. And so please join us. Even if you end up not joining us today, just know that every day this year, our entire staff is here waiting for you to come to our website and decide today is the day that you're going to volunteer, or today is the day you're going to donate. And as soon as you make that decision, we will be there for you. We will actualize your desire to have an impact this year. So thank you. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Ren. And thank you, all of you, for spending an hour of your time with us today. I can't wait to make an impact with you this year.
Have a good night, everyone.